There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a bus station at 2 a.m., not the silence of an empty room. The silence of a room that is waiting. Fluorescent lights humming just a little too loud. A vending machine cycling its compressor every few minutes like it's breathing. The smell of old coffee and floor wax. And somewhere, always, the low murmur of a television bolted to the wall, playing to no one. It was this kind of silence that surrounded a gray, hard-shell suitcase sitting against the far wall of the Continental Trailway station in the small city of Milldale in the American Midwest on the morning of October 14, 1978. The suitcase had been there, according to the station's night clerk, for at least 11 hours, maybe longer. Nobody could say for certain, because nobody had thought to look at it until it became a problem. It was a plain suitcase, steel gray, hard-sided, the kind sold at any department store of the era. No airline tags. No name written on the little leather luggage tag looped through the handle, because there was no luggage tag at all. Just a suitcase sitting by itself against a wall in a room full of strangers passing through. By the time anyone thought to ask whose is this, the answer had already left town. Whoever set that suitcase down had walked out the door and, as far as anyone has ever been able to prove in the 40-plus years since, vanished from the face of the earth. What was inside that suitcase would turn a routine lost and found problem into one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in the state's history. A case with a body but no name. A crime but no scene. A suspect everyone has a theory about, and no one has ever proven. This is the story of the suitcase no one claimed. Milldale in 1978 was the kind of town every state has a dozen of. Population just under 40,000. A meatpacking plant on the east side. A two-screen movie theater downtown. A Trailways bus station that connected it to Chicago in one direction and Kansas City in the other. It was not a place where anything happened. That was more or less the whole point of living there. The bus station sat on 4th Street, a squat brick building with a curved Art Deco awning left over from the 1940s, when Trailways buses were still something glamorous. By 1978, the glamour had worn off considerably. The station was open 24 hours, mostly because the buses ran at odd hours. But overnight it was staffed by a single clerk, a young man named Russell Voss, 26 years old, who worked the graveyard shift because it paid an extra 40 cents an hour and let him take classes at the community college during the day. Russell would later tell police that the overnight of October 13th into October 14th had been unremarkable. 3 buses came through, a 9:40 p.m. arrival from Kansas City, an 11:55 p.m. departure toward Chicago, and a 4:15 a.m. arrival from Omaha. In between, the station had its usual overnight population, a couple of servicemen waiting on connections, an elderly woman who Russell recognized because she came through every few weeks to visit her son, and the general drift of people who use a 24-hour bus station as a warm place to sit when they have nowhere else to be. Russell noticed the suitcase around 1 a.m., sitting against the wall near the row of plastic bucket seats closest to the door. He assumed reasonably that it belonged to someone waiting for the 4:15 arrival, or that someone had simply set it down to use the restroom or the payphone. Lost luggage was not unusual at a station like this. People left bags to buy a sandwich at the diner next door, or fell asleep and forgot which bag was theirs when the boarding call came. By 6 a.m., when Russell's shift ended and the day clerk came in, the suitcase was still there. No one had asked about it. No one had come looking. It sat, untouched, for the rest of that day. It wasn't until the following evening, nearly 36 hours after, Russell first noticed it, that station management decided something needed to be done. Under normal circumstances, An unclaimed bag might sit in a back office for weeks before anyone bothered to open it, waiting to see if an owner turned up flustered and apologetic. But two things made the staff uneasy enough to act sooner. The first was the weight. The suitcase was heavy, heavier than a bag of clothes had any right to be. When the day manager, a woman named Doris Kellerman, tried to move it into the back room, she found she could barely lift it off the ground. The second was the smell. It was faint at first, the kind of thing you'd write off as a spilled drink or a forgotten lunch. By the second day, it was not something anyone could write off any longer. Doris called the Milldale Police Department a few minutes after 7 p.m. on October 15th. Two officers arrived within the hour, and what they found when they finally forced the suitcase's latches would turn a quiet, Midwestern bus station into the center of a mystery that has never, to this day, been fully solved. We are not going to describe every detail of what the responding officers found that night. Some things don't need to be relived in full for a story to be understood, and there is a person at the center of this case who deserves to be spoken about with some measure of dignity, even now, even without a name. What we can say is this: inside the suitcase was a body, a woman, according to the medical examiner who was called in that same night, believed, based on the initial examination, to be somewhere between 25 and 35 years old. She had been deceased for what investigators estimated to be somewhere between 2 and 4 days before the suitcase was found, which meant that whoever left it in that bus station had been carrying, quite literally, a secret that was already several days old. There was no identification of any kind inside the suitcase. No wallet, no papers, no jewelry with an engraving, nothing sewn into a coat lining, no laundry marks on what clothing she had. Her fingerprints were taken and run through every database available to law enforcement in 1978, which, it's worth remembering, was a far more limited system than what exists today. There was no match. Dental records were compared against missing persons reports from the surrounding 6 states. Nothing. The medical examiner's report, portions of which were later made public as the case dragged into its 2nd and 3rd year without resolution, indicated a cause of death that pointed towards strangulation, though the exact circumstances remained, in the examiner's own words, difficult to determine with confidence, given the condition of the remains and the several days that had passed. What captured the imagination of investigators, and eventually the public, were the smaller details. Details that didn't add up to an answer, but that were strange enough to be unforgettable. She had recently had her nails professionally manicured. A small detail, but an odd one for a woman who was about to become the object of a citywide investigation with no name attached to her. She was wearing a wedding ring, but there was no marriage license, no missing husband, no family that ever came forward in over 4 decades to claim it. And folded into the lining of the suitcase, tucked behind a thin cardboard divider that separated the main compartment from a smaller pocket, investigators found a single item that would become the emotional center of the entire case: a photograph, black and white, slightly creased, showing a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of a house that no one has ever been able to identify. No writing on the back, no date, no name. To this day, no one knows who that little girl was, whether she was the victim's daughter, a sister, a niece, or someone entirely unconnected, carried in that suitcase for reasons that will likely never be understood. It is, in the opinion of many who have studied this case over the decades, the single most haunting piece of evidence in the entire file. A photograph of a child, tucked away by someone, for reasons we will probably never know, found beside a woman no one has ever been able to name. The Milldale Police Department in 1978 was not a large agency. roughly 40 sworn officers, covering a city of under 40,000 people. A homicide of this nature, with no identified victim and apparently no crime scene beyond a bus station where dozens of unconnected strangers had passed through in the preceding day and a half, was far outside the department's usual caseload, which mostly consisted of property crime, the occasional bar fight, and traffic enforcement. Lead investigator Detective Harlan Pruitt, a 20-year veteran of the department who had 2 years left before retirement when the case landed on his desk, would later describe it in a newspaper interview as the case that ended my career and started my nightmares, in that order. The first challenge was the most basic one, figuring out who she was. Investigators pulled every missing persons report filed in the state over the preceding 6 months. They expanded the search to neighboring states. They circulated dental records and physical descriptions to police departments as far away as Denver and St. Louis. They contacted every dry, cleaner and department store in a 100-mile radius, hoping the suitcase itself, a specific model, sold through a specific chain of stores, might be traced to a purchase record. It was a common enough model that this went nowhere. Thousands had been sold across the Midwest in the preceding 3 years. The second challenge was even harder, figuring out who had carried her there. The trailway station had no security cameras in 1978, a detail that seems almost unbelievable by today's standards, but was entirely normal for a small-town bus depot at the time. The only witness to anyone near the suitcase was Russell Voss, the overnight clerk, and his memory of the previous night's foot traffic was, understandably, vague. He recalled a man in a dark coat sitting near that section of benches sometime after midnight, but could not describe his face, his height, or even confirm with certainty that this man had been the one to leave the suitcase rather than simply sitting near it. Detectives interviewed every bus driver who had come through the station in the relevant window. They interviewed ticket agents. They interviewed the servicemen who'd been waiting that night, the elderly woman who came through regularly, and dozens of passengers who were tracked down through ticket manifests in the weeks that followed. Nothing produced a solid lead. What they did have was the suitcase itself and the small collection of items inside it, each of which became its own miniature investigation. The wedding ring was traced to a jeweler in a city roughly 200 miles away, a promising lead that investigators pursued for months, only to discover that the jeweler's records from that era were incomplete, and the specific ring style had, again, been common enough to have been sold to dozens of customers whose names had never been recorded. The clothing she wore was examined for laundry marks, tailoring alterations, and store labels, leading investigators to 2 different department store chains, one based in Chicago and one in Kansas City, both plausible given the bus routes running through Milldale. Neither lead produced a name. And the photograph, the little girl standing in front of an unidentified house, was shown to newspapers across 3 states in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize the child or the house. Hundreds of tips came in. None of them checked out. By the spring of 1979, 6 months into the investigation, Detective Pruitt's team had interviewed more than 300 people, chased down leads across 11 states, and were, in his own words, no closer to a name than the night we opened that suitcase. In the absence of a confirmed identity or a confirmed suspect, theories filled the vacuum, as they always do in cases like this. Some were pursued seriously by investigators. Others lived mostly in the realm of local rumor, town gossip, and eventually, decades later, internet forums and true crime message boards. We'll walk through the major ones here, because understanding what didn't pan out is often as important as understanding what did. Theory 1. The traveling companion. The most straightforward theory was also the one investigators pursued hardest in the earliest months. that the victim had been traveling with someone, a husband, a partner, a companion, who killed her somewhere along a bus route and used the anonymity of a busy interstate depot to dispose of the body in the least suspicious way imaginable. A suitcase, after all, draws far less attention in a bus station than almost anywhere else in American life. It is, in a strange way, the perfect place to hide one, because it is the one place where an unattended suitcase is not immediately alarming. This theory gained some traction from the fact that Milldale's Trailway Station connected several major routes, meaning the traveling companion, if one existed, could have boarded in one city, ended things somewhere between stops, and disembarked in Milldale specifically because it offered a long enough layover to walk away clean and catch a connecting bus in another direction entirely, effectively erasing any trail. This theory gained some traction from the fact that Milldale's Trailway Station connected several major routes, meaning the traveling companion, if one existed, could have boarded in one city, ended things somewhere between stops, and disembarked in Milldale specifically because it offered a long enough layover to walk away clean and catch a connecting bus in another direction entirely, effectively erasing any trail. Investigators pursued this angle by cross-referencing ticket manifests from the buses that had passed through in the relevant window, looking for any male passenger traveling alone who had purchased a one-way ticket, paid in cash, and never appeared on a connecting manifest under a traceable name. They found several candidates. None could be conclusively tied to the case, and in an era before widespread photo identification requirements for bus travel, most cash-paying passengers left no trail at all. Theory 2. The local connection. A second theory, which gained more traction among locals than among the investigators themselves, held that the victim was not a stranger passing through at all, but someone with a connection to Milldale, possibly even someone from the town, and that the bus station had been chosen specifically because it created the appearance of a stranger passing through, misdirecting police away from a local suspect entirely. This theory found some support in an odd detail that emerged during the investigation. Fiber evidence recovered from the suitcase lining suggested it had, at some point, been stored somewhere with a specific and somewhat unusual carpet fiber, a synthetic blend that was, according to a forensic consultant brought in later in the investigation, more consistent with certain furnished apartments and boarding houses than with a personal home. This led investigators to spend several weeks in early 1979 canvassing every rooming house and short-term rental in Milldale and the surrounding county, cross-referencing tenants against missing persons databases. Nothing came of it directly, but the theory has persisted for decades among those who've studied the case, partly because it would explain something that has always nagged at researchers. Why Milldale? If the goal was simply to abandon the body in an anonymous location, there were larger, busier stations along the same bus routes. Chicago, Kansas City, that would have offered far more anonymity than a small-town depot where a night clerk was likely to notice an unclaimed bag within hours. The choice of Milldale, some have argued, suggests either familiarity with the town or a specific reason to be there in the first place. Theory 3. The coincidental discovery. A less popular but occasionally floated theory holds that the suitcase was never meant to be found in Milldale at all, that whoever left it intended to retrieve it later, perhaps to move it further along the bus route or dispose of it in a different, more remote location, and that circumstances, a missed connection, a change of plans, sheer panic prevented that from happening. Under this theory, the crime of leaving the suitcase in a public bus station wasn't the plan. It was a mistake, an improvisation born of panic, which might explain why so little care seems to have gone into concealing the victim's identity, beyond the basic removal of identification. This theory has never been provable one way or the other, but it's worth noting because it reframes the entire case, not as a carefully planned disposal, but as a crime of panic that simply happened to intersect with a bus station at exactly the wrong or right moment. Theory 4. An organized element. The fourth and most sensational theory, the one that has fueled the most speculation over the decades, particularly once the case found new audiences through true crime podcasts and forums in the 2010s and 2020s, suggests that the victim may have had some connection to organized activity passing through the Midwest's bus and rail corridors in the late 1970s, whether that meant trafficking, organized crime logistics, or some other illicit network that used interstate bus lines as a means of movement precisely because they were harder to monitor than air travel. It's worth being direct here. There was never any confirmed evidence tying this case to organized crime. Detective Pruitt himself, in a later interview, pushed back directly against this theory, noting that everybody wants an interesting explanation, wants it to mean something bigger. Sometimes a terrible thing happens to somebody, and it's just terrible, without being part of anything else. But the theory has persisted, in part because of one unresolved detail we haven't discussed yet, a detail that came to light nearly a decade after the initial investigation, and that reopened the case in ways no one expected. In September of 1987, nearly 9 years after the discovery in Milldale, a remarkably similar case emerged roughly 340 miles away at a Greyhound station in a mid-sized city in a neighboring state. The details were not identical, but the similarities were enough to make investigators in both jurisdictions sit up and take notice. A hard-shell suitcase left unattended in a 24-hour bus depot. No identification on the victim inside. A period of several days between the estimated time of death and the suitcase's discovery. And most strikingly, a small personal item folded into the lining. This time, not a photograph, but a child's hair ribbon tucked into an inner pocket in a way that seemed deliberate rather than incidental. The Milldale case file was pulled and cross-referenced. Detective Pruitt, by then approaching retirement, was brought in to consult. For a brief period in late 1987, investigators in both states believed they might be looking at the work of the same person, a pattern rather than an isolated tragedy. The theory ultimately could not be confirmed. Forensic techniques of the era were not advanced enough to draw a definitive link between the two cases, and several key differences emerged during the 1987 investigation that made some detectives skeptical of a connection. The estimated age of the second victim was notably younger. The method believed responsible for her death did not precisely match the original examiner's findings from Milldale. And, perhaps most significantly, the second case was resolved within 18 months. When the victim was eventually identified through dental records, and the investigation led to an arrest of someone with no apparent connection to Milldale or the earlier case at all. That resolution effectively ended serious law enforcement interest in a connection between the two cases. But the similarities were never fully explained, either, and the Milldale case file to this day contains a cross-reference note to the 1987 case. An open thread that was investigated, narrowed, but never entirely closed. For researchers and true crime followers who've picked up this case in the decades since, the 1987 parallel remains one of the most tantalizing what-ifs in the whole story. A pattern that almost fit, and then didn't, leaving behind more questions than it resolved. The Milldale case went cold, not officially closed, because homicide cases are rarely closed in the way people imagine, but functionally cold, in the sense that active investigations slowed to a trickle by the early 1980s and had all but stopped by the time Detective Pruitt retired in 1980, less than 2 years after the case began. The unnamed woman was eventually buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Milldale, under a stone that reads simply, Jane Doe, found October 1978. For years, the grave was maintained by a small group of local volunteers, several of them retired police officers, including Pruitt himself, who reportedly visited every October for the rest of his life until his death in 2003. He told a local reporter in 1998 that he never stopped thinking somebody somewhere was missing her and just never knew where to look. The case resurfaced periodically over the decades. In 1992, a local newspaper ran a 10-year retrospective that generated a small wave of new tips, none of which panned out. In 2003, following Pruitt's death, a feature in a regional magazine brought renewed attention and, for the first time, made the photograph of the little girl publicly available in a widely circulated format, hoping someone might recognize her. Still nothing. The most significant development came in 2015, when advances in forensic genetic genealogy, the same techniques that had begun cracking open decades-old cold cases across the country, were applied to DNA, evidence preserved from the original 1978 examination. This was, in many ways, the last best hope for identifying the victim after the fingerprint and dental record searches of the 1970s had gone nowhere. The genetic testing did produce a partial result, a distant familial match, several generations removed, suggesting the victim likely had ancestry connecting to a specific region of the country, and possibly, more specifically, to a particular immigrant community that had settled in the Midwest in the early 20th century. It was progress, the first concrete new information about the victim's identity in nearly 40 years, but it was not, on its own, enough to produce a name. Genetic genealogists have continued working the case in the years since, and as of this telling, investigators believe they may be within reach of a more specific identification, though nothing has yet been confirmed publicly. The little girl in the photograph has never been identified. The man in the dark coat that Russell Voss glimpsed that night in 1978, if he was ever involved at all, was never identified either. Russell Voss himself passed away in 2011, having given his last interview about that night just 2 years before his death, in which he said the thing he remembered most, more than any face or detail, was simply how ordinary the whole night had felt. "That's what gets me," he said. "It felt like nothing, just another night. And it turned out to be the only time in my whole life something like that would ever happen around me. And I don't even remember his face." As of this telling, the woman found in that suitcase in October of 1978 remains officially unidentified. Her case remains open technically, in the same way most unsolved homicides remain open indefinitely. A file that exists, that is occasionally revisited, that no one has given up on entirely, even if active investigation happens only when new forensic technology or a new tip makes it worthwhile. Genetic genealogists working cold cases across the country have expressed cautious optimism that cases like this one, cases that seem permanently unsolvable in the 1970s and 1980s, may eventually be resolved through DNA techniques that didn't exist when the crime occurred. It has happened in other cases. It may yet happen in this one. What remains unresolved, and may always remain unresolved, is the question of who left that suitcase and why. Whether it was a stranger passing through on a bus, using the anonymity of a small town depot to erase a crime committed somewhere down the line. Whether it was someone local, someone who knew Milldale, who chose that station specifically because they knew how long it would take anyone to notice. Whether the 1987 case, 340 miles away, was ever truly connected, or whether it was simply a tragic echo. Two unrelated horrors that happened to look alike from a distance. And there's the photograph. The little girl standing in front of a house no one has ever identified. tucked into the lining of a suitcase for reasons that died with whoever put her there. Somewhere, there may be a family who has wondered for over 4 decades what happened to a mother, a sister, a daughter who simply stopped writing, stopped calling, stopped coming home, never knowing that the answer has been sitting, unclaimed and unnamed, in a small cemetery in the Midwest since 1978. If you know anything, if any detail in this story sounds even distantly familiar, a family story half remembered, a name that was never quite explained, Milldale's current police department, and the genetic genealogists working alongside them would still very much like to hear from you. Cold cases are not solved by detectives alone. More often than people realize, they're solved by someone watching a story like this one, sitting up and remembering something they didn't know mattered. Somewhere out there, someone knows who she was. Somewhere there might be an old photograph in a drawer, or a name half remembered at a family dinner, or a story about someone who just left one day and never came back. A story that was never quite explained, because no one ever had a reason to connect it to a bus station 340 miles away more than 40 years ago. That's the thing about cases like this one. They don't stay buried because no one remembers. They stay buried because the person who remembers doesn't know what they're holding. If this case stuck with you, the way it stuck with the people who've spent their careers on it, let us know your theory in the comments. Which explanation do you find most convincing? The stranger on the bus, the local connection, the eerie echo of 1987? Or do you think the real answer is something none of us have considered yet? If you want more cases like this one, the ones that don't come with a tidy ending, the ones that ask more of you than they answer, make sure you're subscribed to Shelby's Den and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, stay curious and take care of each other.